In part two of our look at the history of suburbs, we're going to focus on the role of transportation. And we're going to go back to a time when muscle power was the primary form of transportation. And by muscle power, we're really talking about horse drawn transportation. And we look at our walking cities, and you'll notice in our walking cities, we have a high level of integration, both functional and social integration. This was a time when our higher economic class wasn't able to separate much from our middle and lower classes on a day-to-day basis. So the walking cities created a scenario where the outskirts were undesirable, meaning they weren't really accessible because, again, we had to be confined because we didn't have modern transportation technologies. There was this idea or this popular sentiment, a culture, that the downtown area, wasn't a place for women or children. So the culture started to promote this idea that the outskirts would provide a more hospitable residential area. And what we found in the walking city was that the affluent groups, the wealthiest groups, started to find second homes outside of the city, country estates, family homes. So the early suburbs and the walking cities, we would have a scenario where most people lived in a functionally and socially integrated area, but our wealthiest group separated a city house or a townhouse from a country house. Here's an image of Baltimore, Maryland in 1796, and you'll see that the area of development was right around Baltimore's Inner Harbor and Fells Point. This example would serve us well to understand what a walking city was like. Here's an image of the Inner Harbor. Again, you could see the congestion, you could see the activity, you could see the mix of commercial and residential spaces. Then outside of this harbor area, we had our country housing, our summer estates. And you can see again, these areas that are circled would have existed beyond the fringe of the socially and functionally integrated walking city. The image on your screen is of Johns Hopkins' former summer house in Lake Clifton. Again, these areas, these estates were maintained over time as they were sold off as cemeteries or parks for the city of Baltimore. But we should start to recognize here the role of transportation. Early on, these four areas that are circled would have been on the urban fringe. But over the course of the 19th, 20th, and 21st century, we see all of that infill development that was made possible by streetcars, by rail, and later on by roads and highways. Another suburban area that developed during this time was known as the Gold Coast in Long Island. And this area was the summer and country estates for what were known as the titans of industry, the wealthy families of New York City. Now, the Gold Coast in the late 1800s was made accessible by rail connections. So unlike our previous example of the walking city where the country estates were found literally within 3 miles of downtown, rail connections allowed the wealthiest groups to find these summer and country estates out on Long Island. The book The Great Gatsby, the story of Gatsby was influenced by the development of this Gold Coast. Here you can see one of the mansions, one of the estates. This early suburb was not designed for middle and upper middle class Americans. This early suburb was designed as a place of separation, a place of exclusivity for the titans of industry. The Woolworth family, who started what was known as a five and dime, a retailer, grew to great prominence. And they had a house pictured here on Fifth Avenue in New York City that sold within the last decade. And they also had their mansion in Glen Cove on the Gold Coast. So these were the type of families, these prominent American families, kind of like your Bezos today. People that run Google, people that run Amazon, people that run Microsoft. That was what the suburbs reflected in the late 1800s, those types of American families, that type of exclusivity and wealth. So when we look at the role of transportation going back about 200 years, early on, there wasn't much, right? With our walking city, we could go about as far as we could walk, as far as a horse could take us for our affluent families. In 1814, the Fulton Ferry connected Manhattan to Brooklyn, and this established Brooklyn as what's often recognized as our first modern suburb, where individuals who weren't just the wealthiest were able to connect between work and home, were able to go across the East River so they could work in Manhattan and live in Brooklyn. So early on, ferries began to increase how far we could go from the downtown areas. And obviously, ferries aren't available everywhere. So it was a relatively limited distance and only a few parts of our cities that could be connected by ferry. What really transformed how far we could go is what's known as the omnibus. And the omnibus is pictured here as a horse-drawn cart. So a horse-drawn carriage, again, not just for the most affluent, but for the masses, was able to extend how far we could go. So now, 3 or 4 miles for your middle class workers wasn't a big deal. The horse-drawn omnibus would run on rails. And you can see the picture here of the horse-drawn omnibus in Baltimore that connected Baltimore with its historic suburb of Catonsville. Now it's known as an inner ring suburb. So this was in 1885. Shortly thereafter, by the late 1800s, we began to have the electric streetcar. And the electric streetcar allowed people to go even farther from downtown at a reasonable cost. So we start to see here how transportation transforms where we could go, how quickly we could go. And as transportation became more efficient, our middle class population was able to venture into the suburbs. The image on your screen shows the spatial impact of transportation in the suburbs on the Baltimore region of Maryland. You can see in 1792 how Baltimore was just that walking city, the area highlighted in yellow in the top left panel. By 1851, we could see the growth of the omnibus, and the growth of the omnibus extended that metro area, that downtown area. It allowed for different routes to extend out of the city, and then along those routes we had infill development. So it wasn't just along the omnibus route, but then a few blocks off of the route, we saw the suburbs grow. By 1900, when we had the electric streetcar, you could see the growth northward out of the city. And you could see some of those radial lines, the lines extending outward of the mass, the yellow mass, that show us where those early streetcar lines existed. By 1925, we started to introduce the automobile, which allowed us to extend beyond the streetcar lines. By 1966, we had a large investment in local roads, in U.S. highways. And then by 1992, we realized a number of our interstate roadways. So you could see here the expansion of Baltimore City in yellow as it relates to the growth of transportation technology. And we can't overstate the importance of transportation technology when we look at the physical expansion of our suburbs. So when we look at the way in which transportation impacted our suburbs, it absolutely expanded our city size. So the physical footprint, the perimeter of our metropolitan area expanded with each of these forms of transportation. That's without doubt. What we also see occur over the 19th, 20th, and 21st century is an increase in social class division. So as our middle class was able to afford an omnibus, as our middle and upper middle class were able to afford a longer route out of the city, we saw middle and upper middle class neighborhoods evolve the farther we get from the downtown area. The image on your screen shows how the distance from downtown ties closely to different social classes. Now, you'll recall how this pattern reflects the concentric zone model, and how the farther out we go, the more affluent our neighborhoods become. And again, that's because transportation technology became more readily available. It became more affordable, but it wasn't affordable for our working class. It wasn't affordable for a lot of our poorer communities. So while it became more affordable, it meant that it wasn't only for the wealthiest, but our middle and upper middle class began to spread out, began to move farther out of downtown, and they moved out along these rail lines. The image on your screen now is of the Stoneleigh neighborhood, which is just south of Towson University's campus. And the image on the bottom left is the former streetcar station, and that's still there today. Businesses have occupied this space that don't serve a streetcar community anymore. Rather, they reflect the modern suburban neighborhood. But this development, the Stoneleigh neighborhood, reflects the upper middle class movement out of the downtown area along the streetcar line. This slide shows the growth and expansion of the MBTA in Massachusetts. Now, if we were to track suburban development, we would find a one-for-one connection between the expansion of these streetcar and later subway lines and the growth of suburban neighborhoods. So you could watch through the early 20th century the expansion of these different lines. And again, if we had an overlay map, we would see the expansion of suburban neighborhoods and commuter communities. So by the 1930s, the Green Line expanded far west out of Boston to further promote growth. In the 1950s, we see the Blue Line heading northeast. The Red Line had already established communities south and northwest of the city. So when we look at the role of transportation, following the streetcar line and the development of those suburbs, we saw the growth of automobile suburbs. And the biggest policy that affected the expansion of suburbs in terms of automobiles was the 1956 Highway Act. This Highway Act afforded or promoted, signed off on a third of the U.S. budget. So the United States, through the federal government, put a tremendous effort in financial backing into the highway system. So the social impact here was the further extension of our suburban areas. So the Highway Act in 1956 built upon earlier roadways, built upon the suburbanization that was promoted by streetcar lines, and offered a lifestyle that was farther out, that was farther out on the metropolitan fringe. So between the omnibus, the streetcars, and later the automobiles, we see that physical expansion of our metropolitan area. Transportation technology allows people to go farther at a more affordable price. And here we see the important connection between transportation and policy, where the United States fully supported the expansion of our metropolitan areas by way of automobile.